Right. You should be good to go, Isaac.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. We had panelists from across the world yesterday with us, and I trust that's the case today. We're here to have a brief recap session of what occurred yesterday. We had a panel on Matthew within Judaism. Two of the panelists are available and willing to give us a recap of what happened. Susan Risky, excuse me, and John Campen. And then we had a panel on First Peter and James within Judaism. And Gabriele Boccaccini, who is the co-chairing this and co-directing this conference, was one of the panelists, happens to be one of the panelists, and will also give us a few words of summary about how that panel went. Once each of the summaries are made for about 3 minutes each, if there's still a little bit of time for discussion, any of the panelists amongst us who were here yesterday can join in and offer a few more comments or questions. Of course, we have the chat box, which is available for anybody to interact with. And then about 5-10 minutes before 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to take a little pause so we can get ready for the first session today, which is on Luke and Acts within Judaism. Thereafter, we'll have our second panel for today dealing with Hebrews within Judaism. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Susan Risky to be the first one to provide us with some thoughts about how things went yesterday in the Matthew panel.
Great. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Slideshow, great. Okay, well, we had some stimulating discussion in the Matthew Within Judaism section. Six of us were, let me see here, why is this not working? There we go. Six of us were panelists. Three spoke more on themes in Matthew, presenting case studies of sort for this question, and then three presented more comprehensively on this issue. And then we had two discussants as well engaged. So we all agreed that Matthew should be read within Judaism, but the question really came down to what criteria we should use for this. So should we look at Matthew's voice? Does Matthew think like a Jew, for example? His social world that we see through the text, or specifically focusing on his community or communities? Of course, what we can know from that based on Matthew as a gospel. We asked the question, what kind of document did Matthew think he was writing? And this was the question that we wanted to get to the bottom of. And we thought a fruitful way of speaking about this issue is to speak of Matthean Judaism. Basically, Matthew's self-understanding rooted in Jewish tradition, though not identical to other first century Judaisms. And the question then came down to not if Matthew should be read within Judaism, but what kind of Judaism Matthew represents. What does Matthean Judaism look like? What tools do we use to determine this? We also discussed groupness, speaking of Matthew's audience as a sect rather than a community. We saw that Matthew was a sectarian document within the diversity of first century Judaism, and we discussed the role of conflict in the community that Matthew, or communities that Matthew speaks to. So sectarian traits showing up in the midst of conflict and chaos. And we also discussed how the conflict the Jesus movement had with the Jewish leaders influenced group identity. We also explored Jewish practices. How did Matthew's audience, for example, engage in Jewish practices differently than most Jewish sects? So clearly, Matthew's Judaism is unique among the Judaisms of that day. And in what way is it unique? And this needs to be explored further. We also discussed the relationship between Matthew and Mark. If Matthew is a sectarian document, what do we do with its dependence on Mark? And does that make Mark a sectarian text? So we felt like there was a lot more to be done here in relation to the relationship and the nature of Mark itself. And we also explored Matthew's outreach to the Gentiles, all agreeing that it's rooted in the Jewish vision, but discussing how unique Matthew's vision was for mission outreach to Gentiles. Was it unique among other Jewish sects, or was it similar to how other Jewish groups were reaching out to the Gentiles, and what role this plays in his form of Judaism? We discussed 3 specific texts that present difficulties for this issue: Matthew 21:43, 27:25, and 28:15. Whether Matthew is distancing himself there from the Jews, or these other verses actually where Matthew fit, what is Matthew thinking in terms of his community, and also our concerns with anti-Semitism. So now the joke of the session was Jews fast and Gentiles have fun. So we did have a little humor there, although I have a very good friend who's a Messianic Jew, and he would debate that statement. So, but overall, it was a very rich session. Lots of new thoughts and new questions to be explored.
Thank you, Susan, for that concise but really precise and detailed summary of what happened yesterday. There's a second panelist from the Matthew Within Judaism who's available to talk a little bit, and that is John Campen. John Campen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. That was a very good, comprehensive summary. I'm not sure that in terms of the overall session, that was excellent. And so I'll just make comments on a few of the points within that summary, recognizing, of course, the initial premise that led into the discussion in the rest of the day, that the within Judaism perspective, the whole discussion about it's very problematic and very helpful. And we continue to have that particular debate within the general discussion. One point of discussion that Susan highlighted was the question about the nature of the Matthean community, whether Dan Gertner raised the question about whether we should even use that word with regard to Matthew, and the question about the general question about the relationship of literary texts and community. That's a really problematic one, and probably deserves more discussion with regard to how we deal with that issue from a within Judaism perspective, because as Anders Runeson, in one of his articles on intergroup conflict, identified at the beginning of his article, the use of the word community from his standpoint, and I would agree, is important. It presupposes that a literary composition has a very distinct purpose and a distinct audience, and that we can identify that or at least talk about it. And it seems to me that that's important in the within Judaism discussion. So this question that Dan raised is really actually a very important question. The related issue, of course, then is, what does this community designation mean? We talked about groupness and less groupness was language that John von Maren used. We talked about less Jewish and more Jewish. We probably need to focus more distinctly on distinct methodologies for talking about how we relate our discussion about within Judaism to distinct, perhaps sociological methodologies and distinct social structures for understanding the nature of the relationship. And there I would suggest that further discussion, because the other word that kept coming up in our discussion yesterday was the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. It seems to me that within Judaism discussions in general, we use that word, the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, without focusing in on more specifics with regard to where does a particular New Testament writer fit within the diversity. Where does it tack into which types of Judaism, which trajectories of Judaism during the Second Temple period? Where do they fit? And the big question is whether the texts represent a particular trajectory, a literary trajectory through Second Temple Judaism, or are different New Testament texts related to different literary trajectories within Second Temple Judaism? And it seems that that question requires a good deal more discussion in Matthew and in other works in the discussion of this within Judaism perspective.
Thank you for that, John. Yeah, it's been very refreshing to see how the different panels are interacting with this same question in similar yet different ways. Something I was alluding to at the beginning of the opening session yesterday. And my impression, one of the takeaways is that there seems to be a consensus amongst the panelists, much like with the Revelation within Judaism panel, about reading Matthew as a Jewish text, in contrast to some of the other literature that we're covering in this conference. Which moves us to the other literature. Speaking of that, yesterday we had a panel, first time in the Enoch seminar history, a very interesting novel panel on James and First Peter. Gabriele Boccaccini has volunteered to say a few words about that. If we have some time, I also see that Joshua Boombach is with us too, and we might, provide you an opportunity to say any words as well if you would like. But Gabriele, you may go ahead.
More than a report about the group, I would like to express some afterthoughts of it. I've always also posted on our Facebook page yesterday night while I was thinking about what I learned from our first day. I must tell you that the Matthew section was excellent, and so was the James and the First Peter session. That for the first time saw a very interesting discussion about these two documents. So just let me explain what are some points that I got from the discussion in the panel. The first, and I'm very pleased to see that the same ideas, the same concern have emerged in both panels, both in Matthew and in the second panel. First of all, I would say that we all have emphasized that the within Judaism label is an imperfect and highly problematic term. Many would prefer to talk about Matthew or James or First Peter as Jewish text more than using the language of a within Judaism perspective. Nonetheless, everybody has emphasized that heuristically, within Judaism is a very powerful label, as we have seen also yesterday, generating important discussions in New Testament studies. So, in spite of the problems that we have with this term and with concept, this label, I think, has demonstrated to be very, very powerful and effective. Second element that came from the James and 1 Peter discussion was that there are not in the New Testament there are no texts that are more or less Jewish. So we should not discuss if a text is more or less Jewish. There are first century Jewish texts written by followers of Jesus, and we cannot rank, okay? We should not rank the level of Jewishness, okay, of his document. While instead, and here I go back to what John Campen just said, while instead there is an interesting discussion about their degree of sectarianism. Not all Christian texts in the New Testament are equally sectarian. Some are more or less sectarian. So this is without being more or less Jewish. Okay, so the problem of Jewishness and the problem of sectarianism are two independent categories. Third point, once we have concluded that a New Testament text should be considered a Jewish text, it is when the real discussion begins. What kind of Judaism were Matthew, James, or First Peter promoting? And what is their relationship with the other forms of Judaism of their time? Really, the discussion about the within Judaism should be considered the starting point of a discussion, not the end of game. Okay, it's just the beginning of a work that should be done. For element, the Jewishness of a New Testament document should not be measured by the Judaism of the rabbis. So we should not consider the similarities with Rabbinic Judaism the criterion for defining the Jewishness of New Testament text, or an abstract monolithic definition of Judaism. But of course, the Jewishness of a New Testament text must be measured within the confines, the boundaries of the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. And of course, the problem is how flexible are elastic are these boundaries to accommodate different expressions. The fifth point is that the more we study the Jewishness of the New Testament text, the clearer their belonging to the diverse and pluriform world of the apocalyptic groups of Second Temple Judaism becomes. I was pleased that in all our conversation about Matthew and James and Peter, this close connection between New Testament text and apocalyptic movements and groups in Second Temple Judaism emerged. So this, I think, was a very important problem. I will add to this point that I made yesterday two more points very quickly. One is the tension that we have in this text, especially this was raised about First Peter, the strong Christian identity and sharing the larger Jewish context. So I don't think that the two things should be seen in opposition to one another. I mean, in Second Temple Judaism, we had groups that have a strong sense of self-identity, and at the same time, they did not part from the entire Jewish religion, the Jewish community, even though they were often critical. And so I think this is the case also with early Christianity. And finally, it was raised the problem of the implications of what we do. And of course, from a historical point of view, from my point of view, it means that simply what I learned that we should treat the text of the New Testament exactly as we treat the Dead Sea Scrolls or any other corpus of Second Temple Judaism. But on the other hand, I recognized that there are strong theological and religious implications in the relations between Christians and Jews. We are not talking simply of things that belong to the past, even though this an element that we don't have emphasized. Of course, we are all aware that our work has profound implications also for the present self-understanding of Christians and Jews.
Thank you, Gabriele. Yeah, one takeaway for me was just the novelty of having First Peter and James discussed within the setting of the Enoch seminar and the many new participants. There were loads of questions that were raised yesterday during the panel, almost in an overwhelming way. And in a good way, I say that. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to discuss them, but I appreciated many of the very specific questions that were raised. As I was mentioning Joshua Brumbach, then I noticed that you had shared a comment in writing. Joshua, you're under no pressure, but if you want to vocalize what you said, the opportunity is now or never. No, you could always do it some other time in the conference, but right now would be opportune. Yes, go ahead.
No, thank you very much. I agree that the two sessions yesterday on Matthew and then James and First Peter went very well, and there were some really great points that were raised as were just reviewed, and there was also similarities in the way, especially the question of the limitations of the within Judaism label, but also heuristically and just helpful the label is at times too. So it's the challenge of that, and also how do we define the type of Jewish community that these groups are a part of. For me personally, I walked away really kind of chewing on the relationship that we talked about between First Peter and James, or if there is any way, but particularly I was thinking about the challenge of First Peter, especially as someone who I've obviously read through First Peter, but I've never done any deep thinking about it. And the challenge where James is so very clear that his audience is a Jewish audience. And when he speaks about a diaspora, he's really talking about, I don't think there's any real question, at least in my mind, of who his audience is. Like it's a, very straightforward Jewish audience, where that becomes more problematic in First Peter. And there are times in which you start off thinking on the Peshat level, he really is addressing Jews, like as the chosen people. But then when you get into further in the letter, it really does become problematic. And for me, what I was thinking about, because it was related to something you said, Isaac, towards the end about the lateness of James, like I actually see the absence of this complexity in relation to Gentiles in James as just kind of supporting an earlier date rather than a later date, when things aren't more clear cut, if you will, in some ways and not in others. But, and just to kind of add one last thing, and this is the last thing I'll say is my interest in kind of what jumped out to me that I pointed out in the letter of the connections rabbinically wasn't to emphasize anything about the Jewishness or to say anything about the Jewishness of the text itself, as though somehow that was a measuring point, was just an interest. As a scholar of rabbinics, I just thought that was an interesting thing, while recognizing, rabbinic Judaism is obviously much later. We have to look at James and First Peter, all these works within the Second Temple context, but I just thought the connections, that was what happened to interest me. So anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Thanks for sharing your impressions, Joshua. Yeah, and in your comments also, it's something that I would point out. Supersessionism, particularly vis-a-vis First Peter, was brought up. That was one of the sticking questions and something for us to think about. We're going to here take a 5-minute break, as it is 8:55 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, to allow us to get ready for the Luke and Acts session that will start shortly. So see you then in just a few minutes. Are we still live stream, Megan? I'll take that as a yes. Your mic was on mute, but
Yes, I never stopped
good.
it on this one. You're good.
Good. Okay. Uh, okay, so we are going to start. It is 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Welcome to everyone, those maybe just joining us online during this busy week. I know it's very busy for many people. It's the midst of a semester. To the first session of our second day on Luke and Acts within Judaism. So our ambition is to cover the widest range of literature text that we can during this two-part conference. New texts mean we have new panelists with us today, and also maybe some new ideas and new questions to the common questions that have been relayed to all of the participants. The makeup of this panel is slightly different than yesterday's. You can go to the web page, which is in the chat box somewhere, but I'm going to copy and paste that again to everyone to see the latest schedule. That is the order that we are going to proceed in with the presentations. We have first 5 presenters. They have up to 10 minutes each to interact with the 3 questions about the conference. And then after that, we have a equal group of 5 discussants who can share impressions about anything they've heard being said for up to 5 minutes each. So without further ado, we are going to start with the first person listed here, Jocelyn McWhirter from Albion College. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Isaac, and hello from Michigan. I'm just going to jump right in. On January 1st, 2014, my book, Rejected Prophets, Jesus and His Witnesses in Luke Acts, was published. Based on what I wrote then, I'd like to focus now on one criterion for determining whether we can place Luke Acts within Judaism. That criterion is Luke's unique portrayal of Jesus and his witnesses, specifically John the Baptist, Peter, Paul, and Stephen. As Luke tells it, they call out Jewish opposition to Jesus and the apostles. They variously foretell the resulting destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, along with the inclusion of Gentiles in the Jesus movement. These events may have challenged the beliefs of Luke's audience, who might rather have been expecting the imminent return of Jesus, his defeat of the Romans, and his messianic reign in Jerusalem. Luke therefore affirms the God-given authority of Jesus and his witnesses by drawing parallels between them and the prophets like Samuel, Elijah, Elisha, Moses, and Jeremiah. In their times, they too were opposed by Israelites and Judeans. They variously foretold the destruction of the temple. Some even ministered to Gentiles. By alluding to their similarities with Jesus and his witnesses, Luke portrays Jesus, John, Peter, Paul, and Stephen as prophets, thus assuring a questioning audience of the certainty of what they have been taught. And Luke alludes to those prophets in ways that only Jesus followers steeped in Tanakh, that is, mostly Jewish Jesus followers, would understand. Luke opens his 2-volume work by portraying John and Jesus as infant prophets like Samuel, one of only 2 ancient prophets with a canonical narrative. As with Samuel's mother Hannah, John's parents, Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah the priest, have no children. In God's shrine, an emissary assures first Hannah, then Zechariah, that God will give them a son. Hannah brings the child Samuel to the shrine and dedicates him to God. Zechariah describes the infant John as the prophet of the Most High. As with Samuel, John then grows up. Another emissary announces the imminent conception and birth of Jesus. Just as Hannah praises God for her son Samuel, so Mary praises God for the promise of her son Jesus. Like Hannah, she extols the Lord who humbles the mighty and exalts the lowly, and with her husband Joseph, brings her son with an offering to God at the temple. And as with Samuel and John, Jesus grows up. Surely John and Jesus were prophets like Samuel. John's prophetic role consists of announcing the advent of Jesus. All flesh shall see the salvation of God, he proclaims. One who is more powerful than I is coming. Thus endorsed, Jesus begins his ministry with a sermon in the Nazareth synagogue. Luke disarranges Mark's account by using the episode to inaugurate Jesus' public ministry, as well as to introduce the examples of Elijah and Elisha, whom God sent to Gentiles. Although this is Luke's 4th mention of Gentiles, he alters his sources throughout the gospel so that Jesus avoids direct contact with non-Jews. Instead, he uses other techniques to establish Jesus as a prophet like Elijah. Luke's Jesus raises the dead and gives them to their parents. He multiplies food for hungry people. God takes him up into heaven. Because the disciples see Jesus as he is taken up, they inherit Jesus' spirit and perform Jesus' miracles, such as healing the paralyzed and raising the dead. Like Elijah and Elisha, Philip, Peter, and Paul bring the good news to Gentiles. And as with Jesus, many Jews reject Peter and Paul, just as their ancestors rejected Moses and Jeremiah. Luke alludes to several similarities between Jesus and Moses. Like Moses, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. He has 12 disciples. Some believe that he is an ancient prophet who has arisen. When Jesus speaks of his departure on a mountain, God's voice issues from a cloud. Listen to him. His disciples are terrified. Jesus then sends messengers before him and, like Moses, performs signs and wonders. Moses receives more direct attention in Peter's second speech to a Jewish audience. He quotes Deuteronomy 18:15-20. Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up from your own people a prophet like me. You must listen to whatever he tells you." Many listen and believe, but the Jerusalem authorities overall do not. Their opposition culminates in the arrest of Stephen, whose defense introduces the story of Moses, who, after saving an Israelite from an Egyptian adversary, supposed that his kinfolk would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. 40 years later, God sent Moses as their ruler and liberator. But although he led them out of bondage in Egypt, they rejected him a second time by worshiping an idol. At that, says Stephen, God turned away from them. The parallels between the prophets and Jesus are subtle and incisive. As Stephen closes his defense, he emphasizes those parallels with this accusation: your ancestors killed the prophets who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. The Jerusalem authorities then imitate their ancestors by covering their ears and stoning Stephen. As with their ancestors, they reject first Jesus, then prophets like Stephen. I've pointed out how Luke sets up John the Baptist and Jesus as prophets from birth. As such, John gestures at Gentile inclusion and bears witness to Jesus' divine authority. Jesus and his witnesses then act like Elijah, Elisha, and Moses, performing those prophets' miracles, adopting their tactics, and experiencing rejection by their kinfolk. Luke is now ready to introduce parallels to Jeremiah, the prophet who called Judeans to repentance and warned them of conquest by the Babylonians if they failed to listen. Luke's Jesus issues several Jeremiah-like repent or else warnings in response to questions about fatal disasters in Galilee and Jerusalem, previews of the devastation to come. Jesus tells his listeners, unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. He follows up with the parable of a barren fig tree to insinuate that Jerusalem will fall unless they bear fruit. As he approaches Jerusalem, he laments the temple that is soon to be forsaken, and the inhabitants who will soon perish because they did not recognize the time of their visitation. Jesus then enters the temple, driving out the merchants and quoting Jeremiah, "You have made God's house a den of robbers." He continues to predict the Roman siege in the words of Jeremiah, foreseeing days of vengeance, great distress on the land, and Jerusalemites who will fall by the edge of the sword. Jesus' arrest and interrogation even bears some resemblance to the arrest and interrogation of Jeremiah. Both are seized and brought before the Jerusalem authorities. Both are beaten, and both invade their inquisitors' questions. King Zedekiah tells Jeremiah, "I will ask you something." Jeremiah replies, "If I report anything to you, will you not put me to death? And if I advise you, you will not listen to me." The chief priests and scribes demand of Jesus, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." Jesus replies, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer." I'd like to end by pointing out that failure to listen to God's prophets as described in Tanakh is a theme in Luke Acts. Peter and Stephen refer to Deuteronomy 18:15, 18-19. "The Lord your God will raise a prophet like Moses from among your own people. You shall listen to such a prophet. The Lord said, I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet who shall speak to them everything I command. Anyone who does not listen to the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable." Peter and Stephen implicitly relate the prophecy to Jesus, who speaks in parables, so that looking they may not perceive, and hearing they may not understand. Jesus draws the quotation from Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, reprised in full by Paul at the end of Acts. You will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes. Otherwise, they might look with their eyes and listen with their ears and understand with their heart in turn, and I would heal them. But those with a thorough knowledge of Tanakh, who listen closely to God's prophets as portrayed in Luke Acts, will hear and understand the authority of Jesus and his witnesses, who were opposed by the Jerusalem authorities, foretold the destruction of the temple, and were sent to Gentiles who would listen. So thank you all for your attention. Just special thanks now to Gabriele, Isaac, and Megan. Thank you.
Jocelyn. And there will be opportunity, of course, to interact with the comments of the presenters once all the presentations are done and discussants have spoken. In the meantime, don't hesitate to use the chat box and to raise questions, challenges as well. We want to brainstorm together about competing ideas on these matters. We turn to our second presenter, Paul Sloan.
Thank you. Thank you, Isaac, Gabriele, and Megan for coordinating this event. And forgive any sudden departure. I'll be back as I'm able, but I teach class at 9:30 in the morning. So let me open by suggesting that perhaps Luke is not a Jewish text at all. No, I'm just kidding. Can you imagine if I open that way? After all that, no, I think Luke is a Jewish text. So let me first say, actually, though, for two reasons that I prefer not to speak of the label within Judaism, but whether a text ought to be read as a Jewish text. And actually, I wrote this before I heard all of Gabriele's comments, so forgive any repetition here. So first reason why I prefer that, within Judaism, for many, entered the lexicon via the school, Paul within Judaism. However, at this stage, because Paul within Judaism is associated with a school, it's consequently associated with a set of conclusions, not a method. Those conclusions somewhat vary, but pretty stable ones are that conventional Torah observance is still understood as obligatory for Jews, and Gentiles don't become Israel. Notably, many other scholars like Barclay, Wright, and Jason Staples are also motivated to read Paul as a Jewish author, composing Jewish texts about Jewish topoi and figures, and such convictions rightly govern their interpretive methods. But when those same scholars, and others like them, come to conclusions that differ from those named above, some Paul within Judaism scholars would likely conclude that they have not really provided a within Judaism reading. But this implies to me that within Judaism, again, is a set of conclusions, not a method. And once that's the case, debating whether a text is within Judaism, at least when it comes to Paul, will be answered based on whether certain conclusions, which are serving as shibboleths, have been reached. Though this seminar is raising the question about other authors besides Paul, I think that label's origin with that school, and thus its conclusions, may risk skewing the attempt to apply the label to other literary corpora. And I say this as someone who largely agrees with those conclusions that I just named above. So this question, whether a text is within Judaism, is difficult to answer or actually even debate at this stage. Rather, I think we should discuss them as Jewish texts or not, and then not preassume what the conclusions regarding Israel and Torah observance must be. Second, I find it insufficient to discuss whether a text is within Judaism because everyone engaging in the discussion right now rightly knows that Second Temple Judaism was highly diverse. Consequently, because everyone agrees that Judaism is diverse, and because that's been an introductory talking point in almost every talk I've been able to hear, this means that even were we to conclude that, yes, XYZ text is within Judaism, it's not that meaningful of a conclusion because it amounts to saying this text operates as one iteration within this body of very diverse convictions, no single one of which is sufficient for being Judaism. And then I'm afraid we actually haven't said much of anything. So the question I'll be working with is whether Luke may be and is best read as a Jewish text. The answer, I think, is yes. Its topics and protagonists are Jewish. It uses predominantly Jewish sources to ground and express its claims. And a good argument can be made that the author is Jewish, whether native-born or a practiced proselyte, given arguments that have been made by Matthew Thiessen, Isaac Oliver, and others that he is very learned in Jewish halakha. The advantage of this label of reading Luke as a Jewish text is that while it doesn't guarantee certain conclusions, it neither preemptively shuts the doors on others. Once studied as a Jewish text, some questions become askable and thus some conclusions that were thought improbable may be back on the table, if they may be exegetically defended. And to clarify, I actually think that was the goal of the Within Judaism label at the outset. I just wonder if it's outlived that particular utility. So now let me state what kind of Jewish text I think Luke is. First, I think it operates within a framework that others have named Jewish restoration eschatology. Within this framework, Luke describes Jesus as Israel's Messiah, who both heralds and effects the national restoration. This framework also contextualizes the kinds of debates about Torah observance one sees in Luke and Acts. On the one hand, there are debates, like healing on the Sabbath, occasioned simply by Jesus's alternative Sabbath halakha. He argues, I think, that it's permissible because he reads the Sabbath legislation to permit it. On the other hand, there are legal debates occasioned by Jesus's mission, in which his action is defended as permissible or necessary due to the nature and urgency of his divinely authorized mission, such as his healing on the Sabbath of the woman bent double in Luke 13. So consequently, Luke's framing of Jesus as both appointed to herald the restoration and as one who engages in Torah debate positions Luke as a Jewish text that isn't simply engaged in a pattern of religions debate, asking who's doing Judaism better, Jesus or the Pharisees. Rather, some controversies are occasioned by different convictions regarding eschatology. Is it really the time of restoration? And is Jesus really the one divinely authorized to effect it? So what kind of Jewish text is Luke? It's one that is focused on Israel's national restoration and on Jesus as the Messiah appointed to effect it. I want to now examine a test case. Let's look at Luke 9:59 to 60. That text says, he said to another, follow me. But he said, permit me first to go and bury my father. But he said to him, allow the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim everywhere the kingdom of God. Of this verse, Martin Hengel writes that there is hardly one logion of Jesus which more sharply runs counter to law, piety, and custom than does this, by which Jesus expresses, quote, his sovereign freedom in respect to the law of Moses. E.P. Sanders states that here, quote, Jesus consciously required disobedience of a commandment understood by all Jews to have been given by God, meaning that Jesus required, quote, disobedience to God. N.T. Wright employed their conclusions to claim that through such statements by Jesus, quote, the symbols of Israel's worldview had now become redundant. On the contrary, studying this text as a Jewish text has led me to consider it an expression of the kind of legal reasoning that is present in other Jewish texts. For example, Leviticus 21 requires that priests abstain from burying all but their parents, children, brother, and unmarried sister. The high priest may not participate in any burials at all, even of his parents. Presumably, the high priest's duties are of such import that he may not quit them, even to do something also very important, namely bury one's parents. Moreover, Philo states that a high priest may not bury his parents, and he bases this on the import of his duty. The high priest must at all times be ready to perform duties of national significance, which only he can do. But curiously, Martin Hengel argues against that analogy due to a supposed dearth in early Judaism of following this commandment in Leviticus 21. And for support, he states that Philo's exegesis of Leviticus 21:11, quote, clearly shows an anti-ritual bias, end quote. But let's look at Philo's exegesis of Leviticus 21. The high priest must be kept from defilement since, quote, there is no one besides the high priest himself who is permitted to perform his duties instead of him, for which reason he must always be kept free from defilement, in order that, being always ready to offer up sacrifices and prayers, he may continue to fulfill the duties of his office without hindrance, end quote. Though Hengel detects an anti-ritual bias on the part of Philo, I hope I'll be forgiven for detecting an anti-ritual projection on the part of Hengel here. But let's not miss Philo's point. The high priest is not permitted to bury his parents because A, there is no one else who's permitted to perform his authorized duties, according to Philo, and B, his duty is of highest import, offering up prayers and sacrifices for the nation. Therefore, because he alone is authorized and because his authorized duty is highly important, he must leave others to bury his parents. Analogously, Luke's point is that Jesus is A, likewise divinely commissioned to perform duties of national import, the heralding of the restoration, the response to which governs the fate of the nation and the temple. And therefore, B, his mission comes with the same overriding import that the high priest has. When faced with the duty of joining Jesus to herald the kingdom, the would-be follower must leave others to bury the dead. Evidently, Jesus thinks the dead should be buried, so it's not a disavowal of that practice. But Jesus does think that his mission is at least of equal import with the work of the temple, if not greater than the temple, because the temple can neither effect the restoration nor escape judgment if the people don't repent. Therefore, because the mission of heralding the kingdom is of equal or greater importance than the work of the temple, according to Luke's Jesus, those engaged in that task of heralding must leave others to bury their dead. And importantly, I'm not saying that Jesus is like becoming a high priest here. I'm saying that he's comparing the import of their duties. So while this text has been read as exemplifying Jesus' break from Judaism and the law, when read as a Jewish text in light of other Jewish texts, it may show, on the contrary, how Jesus is arguing from accepted premises within his own law and his culture's reading of it. And autobiographically, I'm thankful for scholars and seminars like this one who've examined New Testament texts like Luke as Jewish texts, which has led me to ask questions and learn new interpretations that I might never have asked or arrived at otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Sloan, for that excellent presentation. And by the way, if somebody wants to make the case that Luke is not a Jewish text, you will not be stoned here. We will not close our ears, close our eyes. We will listen to you with open hearts. We want to entertain different ideas. Now we move to our third presenter, Jin Young Kim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss this fascinating theme all together. This is such a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for me too. So today I will present my study on Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, which was, and the study was recently published, so I'm eager to hear what you think about my argument here. So basically, I'm trying to understand, read Luke within Judaism through this text. This passage, where 12-year-old Jesus remains in the temple, has often been read as Christological foreshadowing or as evidence of Jesus' precocious divine wisdom. I will frame it differently, as a text engaging the lingering trauma of the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple, and also as a narrative that offered early readers a therapeutic way to process communal loss. First, let me talk about the theoretical framework of therapeutic reading. Wolfgang Iser's work on reader response reminds us that reading is not passive reception, but an interactive process. Readers bridge narrative gaps with memory, imagination, and emotion. This active participation makes reading potentially transformative. Building on this, bibliotherapy research can help trauma survivors. The stages of recognition, examination, and catharsis allow readers to confront painful memories indirectly and begin to integrate them into new frameworks. Reading becomes a space where memories are revisited, emotions stirred, and trauma reframed. This framework allows us to see Luke chapter 2, 41 to 52, not only as theological instruction, but also as a narrative that invited readers, especially those marked by war trauma, to remember, mourn, and reimagine hope. Let me now turn to the historical context and audience of the Lucan Gospel that I'm thinking. The Jewish war and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE inflicted deep wounds on early ecclesiae, both Jewish and Gentile. Beyond death and enslavement of many Jews, Roman propaganda, such as coins, monuments, and the redirection of the temple tax to Rome, publicly humiliated Jewish identity. Pogroms erupted in diaspora cities such as Alexandria and Antioch, leaving scars across generations. Importantly, trauma was not limited to Jews. Gentile God-fearers, often deeply embedded in synagogue life, also experienced the shock. Many Gentiles in early ecclesiae had long associated themselves with Jewish practices, such as sharing synagogue fellowship, adopting Jewish customs, and even participating in pilgrimages to Jerusalem. For these Gentiles, Jerusalem and the temple were central to their religious imagination as well. The destruction of the temple thus destabilized not only Jewish identity, but also the religious belonging of Gentile sympathizers. For Luke's mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles, the fall of the temple was a shared loss with cross-ethnic, cross-generational consequences. And here I should be able to add some sociological studies on trauma, especially war trauma, that repeatedly points out the lingering effects of the war for several generations after the war. Then let me read the Lucan passage as a therapeutic narrative. In this context, Luke's narrative recalls the trauma of the war in three narratological elements. First, the setting of Passover. Passover commemorated liberation from Egypt, but after 70 CE, it also recalled catastrophe. Josephus notes that the war began at Passover when many pilgrims were trapped in Jerusalem. For Luke's audience, the setting combined memory of salvation with the reminder of destruction. Second, here in this passage, the pattern of pilgrimage is disrupted. Normally, pilgrims travel from the periphery to Jerusalem and then return home, reintegrating the experience into ordinary life. Here, that pattern breaks. Jesus remains in Jerusalem, and his parents must retrace their steps back to the city. Instead of a smooth return, the journey brings anxiety and disorientation. This disruption mirrors how post-war communities experience pilgrimage and memory, not as a closure, but as reopening their wounds. Third, the parents' anxious search for their child. Luke repeats verbs of seeking to intensify Mary and Joseph's panic. Mary's cry, quote, "We have sought you in great anxiety," evokes the parental grief often used to symbolize natural catastrophe. Jeremiah's Rachel weeping for her children, or 4th Ezra's grieving mother, show how parental loss became a metaphor for Zion's devastation. Luke's narrative draws on the same affective register, I think. Taken together, these narratological details show how the story of Jesus in the temple might have echoed the Lucan community's own wounds, turning this episode into a narrative space where the trauma of loss could be remembered and re-engaged. The text also stages intergenerational conflict, another key site where trauma is negotiated. Sociological studies of post-war societies show that younger generations often view the past differently from elders. The older people carry the weight of direct loss, while younger ones push for new interpretations. In the Lucan text, generational tension is dramatized. Mary and Joseph, representing the older generation here, search anxiously for Jesus and painfully return to the temple, embodying their attachment to it as the sacred center where the important thing is found. Jesus, by contrast, remains in Jerusalem with deliberate purpose. The tension is resolved in his enigmatic answer to his mother, quote, "Did you not know that I must be in the things of my Father?" End quote. The Greek phrase here can mean either in my father's house or about my father's business or things of my father. And I think Luke leaves it deliberately ambiguous here. And by doing so, Jesus' answer, on the one hand, acknowledges the parents' attachment to the temple and importance of it, while, on the other hand, shifting the focus beyond its physical ruins to the broader scope of God's ongoing work. The temple remains meaningful, but divine presence is no longer confined to its destroyed walls. It extends into the diaspora ecclesiae where God's works continues. So in conclusion, Luke chapter 2, 41 to 52 recalls the trauma of temple's destruction through the setting of Passover, the disrupted pilgrimage, and the parents' anxious search of their lost child. At the same time, it stages a generation tension over the war as Jesus points beyond the temple to the wider reach of God's work. The story becomes a therapeutic reading for Jewish and Gentile audiences, helping them face grief and imagine new identity and hope after the war. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. We will now go to our fourth presenter, Eyal Regev.
Yeah, Isaac. I'm going to address the question of Luke within Judaism by discussing the issue of the temple. Luke's approach to the temple. Let me share my screen. So I'll go immediately to the beginning of Luke. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
The person on the right. Okay. So it's really important how the story begins. And Luke decided to begin that not just with John the Baptist, but with the birth of John the Baptist, and even more so with the temple, associating John the Baptist with the temple. And I'm not going to read all the steps, we don't have time for that, but you could see how priesthood, sanctuary offerings, incense, and so on, the very beginning, the issues in which Luke begins the story. So he associates John the Baptist, so indirectly Jesus, with the temple. Now, if we move forward, can you see that? Sometimes the slides don't switch. So Jesus is teaching in the temple, and Luke, of course, when we discuss Luke, we are discussing the materials that are peculiar to Luke, the things that he adds, like the birth narrative, the infancy narrative, or additions that he adds upon Mark. So these passages are inserted by Luke in addition to the Markan ones, where he emphasized that Jesus is teaching in the temple, and Jesus is expected to teach in the temple. And of course, teaching is the most prominent thing that Jesus does. Okay, so his association with the temple, in which he's teaching not about the temple, but his spot, his place within theology, society, whatever, is the center of Judaism. This is extremely important. Now, I'm going to go. This slide is personally empty because here we reach to what Luke doesn't say. It is very strange that it doesn't say so, and it relates to the trial of Jesus. You know that in Mark and in Matthew, the first allegation against Jesus that he said that he will destroy the temple. Of course, the allegation is denied. It was told by a false witness, etc. But Luke even doesn't mention the allegation. And he also doesn't mention it when Jesus is on the cross, and in Mark and Matthew, people are mocking Jesus because the Romans are mocking to Jesus because they mentioned that he said that he will destroy the temple. So Luke simply erased this allegation which he of course knew, not only because he read Mark and he wrote Mark, but because it appears in the Acts of the Apostles in allegations against Stephen. So it seems to me that for Luke, it is unhearable that Jesus would have said so. He doesn't want to get the reader the wrong impression that somebody even suspected Jesus to tell such a things against the temple. So I think that this omission is extremely relevant to understand what Luke thought about the temple and his difference in relation, in comparison to the other gospels. Now we go from Luke first volume to the second volume, and here again we see the apostles located in the temple. Jesus, that's supposed to continually in the temple blessing God, and day by day as they spend much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home, ate their food with gladness and with heart fills. I think that some scholars see kind of contrast between temple and home, like the sanctity is removed or screened from the temple to the private homes, but I don't think that's work because you see again that the apostles are associated with the temple, and they do it in both ways. The religious activities and experiences are shared between their private homes and the temple. Now we reach to the issue of prayer, and prayer is taken as alternative to the temple cult, to the sacrificial cult. Well, I don't think it is, and also not in the Acts of the Apostles. And you can see, first of all, one of the earliest evidence for praying not casually, but praying every day in the temple comes from Acts 3:1. Peter and John were going to the temple at the hour of prayer, at the 3 o'clock of the afternoon, literally the ninth hour. So this is the prayer of the afternoon, the mincha prayer, which they join and participate in it, like every other Jews that attend the temple at that time. Now it becomes a little bit more sophisticated when people like Daniel, Judith, and Cornelius are praying in approximately the same hour as the temple prayer, or in the direction to the temple. So they associating their prayer with the temple. And Cornelius was praying in the same hour, just as you can see, at the same hour that Peter and John prayed, and that is in the prayer of the afternoon. And Paul also mentioning being prayer and temple, and that leads us back to Luke's first volume, the parable on the Pharisee and the tax collector with its setting is the prayer in the temple. Well, for Luke, it is obvious that prayer is taking place in the temple, and that the temple prayer is something which is very important religiously for Jews and for Jesus and for the apostles or every person in the spectrum of Luke. So the temple is stressed even incidentally or even indirectly in the theme of the prayer. We can also see that Luke is at pains to give respect to the lay priest, and even this is quite problematic, even to the high priests. He emphasizes that a great many of priests became obedient to the faith, namely to the faith in Jesus. And in the Gospel of Luke, he reiterates Jesus' purification of the leper. One time he just repeats Mark, and he adds his own incident when Jesus orders the lepers to go to see the priest. And this is not just a concern of the bodily purity. This is a recognition of the priestly authority to take care to to examine the lepers and the impure people. So it's a recognition of that Luke is placing about the ability of the priest, the power of the priest within Judean society. And there's one incident, that the high priest are kind of the enemies, the adversaries, the most dreadful enemies of the apostles, and one may say even for Jesus, because of how they sentenced them and so on. But here, Paul, in his trial, so-called trial, or one of these trials, actually recognized the authority of the high priest when he said after the clash, "I did not realize, brother, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people." So I don't know if it's Paul or only Luke, but Luke's Paul acknowledges the authority of the high priest, even in a very unpleasant incident. So if I want to kind of summarize my approach and take it a little bit further to think about the issue of within Judaism, I would say that Luke's temple discourse connects the reader of the lost center of Judaism. Luke imagines and idealizes life in the temple as if it were still standing and as if Jesus was allowed to preach there. The readers visualize free access to the temple. This serves to compensate for the very real distance, spatial, chronological, and social, from the temple which has been destroyed. Curiously, those who may need this compensation the most are Gentile Christians, especially new converts. They have renounced the pagan cults, but remain without a temple. They need an imaginary temple in its place, so they can hold on to God through virtual space and rites. This imagined proximity to the center of Judaism granted early Christianity legitimation as, if it was or was it, a Jewish movement, enabling to share in the core of the Jewish belief and cult. And I made a very short presentation, but if you would like to see more of it and to how it relates to the other approaches to the temple in the New Testament, you can check chapter 5 in my book in Yale University Press, The Temple in Early Christianity. So I would say that the theme of the temple in Luke and in Acts reveals a very intimate, very close relationship of Luke as a reader and his readership, as a writer and his readership to not just Judaism, but the center of Judaism. And my point is that this is very revealing because when Luke is writing, the center is no longer there. And one may have been expected to think that Luke should advance, like actually maybe the rabbis advanced, like the Gospel of John advanced, and to think about an alternative to the temple, and not to connect the gospel and the story and the theology to an institution that is already not there. So I think it's very revealing, and I think it also attests to, I don't know if we call it roots, but I would say that the temple is, first of all, an identity marker for Luke and his audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Eyal. We are now moving to our fifth and last presenter before we allow the discussants to respond, Fadi Atef Mikael.
Thank you, everyone. I think that I will not have much to add after all these discussions about the temple. I recently did my dissertation on the temple centrality in Luke Acts, and so I will just share some thoughts about the centrality of the temple in Luke Acts. First, when I mean reading Luke Acts within Judaism, what comes to mind, or what I mean by this, is recognizing that Luke Acts as a text, as a literary text has an ethnic culture that is rooted in the customs, traditions, sacred spaces, scriptural patterns, history, and these are what I mean by reading Luke Acts within first century Judaism, that it fits into the mosaic of first century Judaism. Of course, scholars usually emphasize that there are plurality of Judaisms, and we always emphasize the S in Judaisms. And I just want to remind us today that they are still Judaisms. So I want to emphasize Judaism before the S today. They are still forms of Judaism. If we still want to read Luke Acts within this framework. One of the strongest indicators that Luke Acts should be read in this way is the centrality of the Jerusalem temple as a sacred space. And there are forms of early Judaism that allegorized the Jerusalem temple or looked for other sacred spaces, other temples, maybe in Egypt or so. But what I want to show today is that at least Luke Acts fits within Jewish groups that still viewed the Jerusalem temple as a geographical center. It's a narrative anchor in the gospel and in Acts. Earlier scholarship during the 20th century used to assume that the author of Luke Acts was a Gentile author. And so came hand in hand with this claim that the temple has been superseded, replaced by either Jesus himself, the emerging Jesus followers as a body of people, as a group of people. And so there was such emphasized discontinuity between the temple and the Jesus movement, especially given the Gentile mission, and that it could not coexist with any sort of devotion to the temple cult. But I think that if we decide to read Luke Acts within the literature of the Second Temple, especially the late Second Temple literature, we can see a different picture. As just Professor Regev just showed, that the opening scene of the gospel happens in the temple, and Zechariah and Elizabeth are both described as righteous before God. And I think that one element that contributes to this righteousness is explicitly linked to their involvement with the temple and following the Jewish law. We must not also dismiss that Zechariah was performing the daily incense offering or the Ta'amid offering in the sanctuary, which we also see appear at different points in the narrative, marked by the 9th hour. And key significant events happen at this timing throughout the narrative of Luke Acts. God's angel appears in the temple when Gabriel, the angel, announces John's miraculous birth. So this is a narrative way to say that the temple is a legitimate place for the human interaction with the divine, just as Yahweh and Moses would speak in the dwelling place or in the tent, like in Exodus 33. Jesus is presented in the temple when he's just a baby with Joseph and Mary. Simeon and Anna are pious figures who are led by the Spirit to go into the temple to encounter Jesus in the temple. So people are coming to see Jesus in the temple. Anna is described as someone who never left the temple, but worshiped there with fasting and prayer night and day. Again, faithful people of God are worshiping in the temple, and a message is being proclaimed from the temple. So very early on in the narrative, it's proclaimed from the temple. We already heard about the Jesus encounter with Jewish teachers in the temple when he was 12. Again, it's a positive interaction. Throughout the narrative or in Jesus' ministry in the gospel, we see Luke employs cultic language that is associated with the temple. In the baptism, in the transfiguration, we see terms like glory, clouds, tents, which again evokes the tent setting or the temple setting, which conveys the divine presence in the sanctuary, just as we read in Exodus, for example, 40:35. Scholarship also long noted that Luke places the climactic third temptation of Jesus at the temple pinnacle, sort to like highlight the significance of the temple early in Jesus' ministry. When Jesus heals 10 men with the skin disease, he instructs them to show themselves to the temple priests and make the required purification offerings, and this is in Luke 5. Well, on top of this being an adherence to the Levitical law, as it appears in Leviticus 13 and 14, it just indicates that Jesus does not nullify the necessity of the temple rituals to complete the purification process. We just heard that after the long trip or the long literary trip that takes place in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, we hear at least 4 times that Jesus was teaching in the temple on a daily basis. So the message was first proclaimed in the infancy narratives from that temple, and Jesus in his ministry now is also continuing to teach the same message from within the temple. So it's coming out from the temple. Things do not change in Acts. It's a positive place in Acts. The disciples are described as, quote, "were continually in the temple, blessing God." They are portrayed as pious Jews who maintain temple-centered lifestyle. They continue to participate in daily worship, prayer, and even in sacrificial offerings. And this is something I talk a lot about in my dissertation, that Luke, more than any other author, speaks about the sacrificial language, perhaps on the same level like Hebrews, for instance. Peter and John's participation, again at the 9th hour service, linked to the daily Ta'amid service, just shows that they were still adhering to Jewish practices, Jewish cultic practices. In Paul's ministry, we see that Paul is committed to the Jewish law and the temple customs. He goes through the purification rites in the temple with 4 other Jewish followers of the way in Acts 21. And again, he does this as a form of refuting the accusations that he told Jews to forsake the law and the temple. So Luke uses this action to show that Paul is innocent of any charges of opposing the temple as an institution, as a religious institution. Paul goes through the purification rituals, shaving heads, offering the purification offering, which is very much consistent with a Nazirite vow. Even Luke mentions that he enters the temple, making public the completion of the days of purification when the sacrifice would be made for each one of them in Acts 21:26. Again, that this is happening after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus shows that Luke is keen to show that the temple is still the proper place of worship, and that the cultic actions are still the proper way to worship inside the temple. When Paul was accused in Acts 24 of profaning the temple, he defends himself that he came back to Jerusalem to worship God. And so this worship is happening inside the temple. In Acts 24:14, he says, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. In few verses later in the same chapter, verse 17, he says, I came to bring alms to my people and to offer sacrifices. So it's very clear that he was in line with the cultic worship of the temple. In Acts 25, he says that I have in no way committed an offense against the laws of the Jews or against the temple. It's just fascinating how Luke takes all of this narrative time to defend Paul against accusations made against him that he downplays the temple. It's fascinating how many chapters are devoted for this cause, for this reason, that Paul is not against the temple. It's as if someone was saying that Paul is against the temple, and we hear these accusations in the narrative, and Luke is just showing how this movement, the way, fits within Judaism. Again, Jesus appears to Luke in the temple to initiate the Gentile mission. And this is perhaps striking because in the history of scholarship, we see that we cannot have a Gentile mission and we still have the temple playing an active role, because those two things cannot work together. And we read about this a lot in the history of scholarship. But it's striking that Acts itself shows us Jesus appearing in the temple to initiate the Gentile mission. I think about it in comparison to the call of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, where God also calls Isaiah in the temple. So it's sort of a call that's happening in the temple to show that this is where it all starts. Now, I want to be very clear that there are some passages in Luke Acts that could be tricky and that we need to pay more attention to. We discussed on the chat Act 7, and there is no time to cover every single passage about the temple in Luke Acts, but quickly, one of the notions, or one of the statements in Act 7 that led many scholars to think that the temple, or that Luke is changing his attitude toward the temple, is when Stephen describes the temple that it's made with hands, and God does not live in places or houses made with hands. Again, reading Luke Acts within Second Temple Judaism helps clarify such vague expressions, because we usually connect reading made with hands, just like the idols who were just mentioned in the speech, that they are made with hands. But if we look into the language about the temple in Philo, in Second Baruch, like there are many texts in the Second Temple Judaism that speaks about a heavenly temple that is not made with hands, and contrasts it with the Jerusalem temple that is made with hands. And so these are technical expressions that we even read about in Hebrews, and perhaps some of the panelists will talk about this later, but it's very clear that these are technical expressions, and there is no just time to explain it all, but in my dissertation, I argue that Luke works within a heavenly temple context and connects both temples. The Jerusalem temple is connected somehow to the heavenly temple, and he's writing after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, but the memory is still alive. And it's sort of like the rabbinic question of, okay, now that the temple is destroyed, what do we do? How do we solve this? Or how do we have this central place. How do we have access again? So I show that there are at least 10 to 15 works from Second Temple Judaism spanning a long time that are focused on the heavenly temple, and the descriptions of the heavenly temple in these writings fits well with the descriptions of an implicit heavenly temple that exists in Luke Acts. I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward for more discussions together. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi. So we now have the opportunity to engage with the discussants. We have 5 discussants lined up here, and they're welcome with the time allotted to them, 3 to 5 minutes each, to respond to any of the points that have been made. Jason Wendell is our first discussant.
Okay, I'll start my clock here. Yeah, great presentations. I have very short time to kind of bring some threads together, but I will try. And what I want to point out is, so when we talk about reading Luke as a Jewish text, the Jewishness of Luke and Acts has actually been really evident to scholars for a long time. Exactly the things that you guys are talking about. So several papers talked about the centrality of the temple, being like the importance and obvious centrality of the temple in Luke's writing, and there's various facets to that which you guys drew out, is a sign of its Jewishness. Paul Sloan mentioned the respect for the law. Obviously, the centrality of the law in Luke Acts, also a sign that this is, I mean, what could be more Jewish, right? The importance of the law of Moses. And Jocelyn touched on this briefly, but this is maybe something we didn't touch on quite as much, is the centrality of the people of Israel, right? That this is something obviously Yerval brought out really well. So these things were obvious, have sort of been obvious for a long time. And I guess the question has been, so what do we do with that? Because I sort of alluded to this in the chat, but for the 19th century German scholars especially, it was like, oh, well, this is an apologetic towards Jewish Christians, maybe overdone, and that sort of thing. That was their interpretation. And they saw it as a negative thing. They saw the Jewishness. They saw it, though. This is the important thing. They saw the Jewishness, but they interpreted that as a negative feature. They're like, this is, and they explained it various ways. And, we've offered various examples, but and this is kind of what I think in this last paper we were getting at is what is the rhetorical purpose of all of this? And maybe it's to actually defend Paul, maybe it's just what it says. But I'll just move on from that. One thing I do want to note, though, we were sort of throwing around the term sectarian yesterday. And I think we use sectarian in a lot of different ways. So let me define how I would understand sectarian rhetoric. Because even though I definitely, I think everyone here is on the same page that because of again, temple law and people of Israel and stuff, this is just obviously Jewish texts. I think we have to grant that. I hope. But thinking about sectarianism and Judaism or Jewishness and sectarianism as different things, I think that's helpful. There's obviously a sectarian sense to what Luke is saying. Like if in Acts 3:22, if Peter can say, let me read it so I don't misquote it. If he can say, you must listen to the prophet like Moses, and it will be that everyone who does not listen to the prophet will be utterly rooted out of the people. There's this sense of we're the good guys, we're the in-group, and you're the out-group, which I see that as a kind of sectarian. I think that's what I would define as a sectarian rhetoric, is what I'm getting at. Sorry, I'm rushing here, so I'm stumbling over myself. But, when I read the Qumran literature, you get we're the sons of light, and you're the sons of darkness that are in ignorance, right? Sectarian rhetoric, we're the faithful line. And what I want to come back to is what Jocelyn was saying, is this representation of the Christian characters as in line with the prophets. There's this way that both the Qumran literature and Luke Acts, they can capitalize on the righteous remnant rhetoric from the prophets. And you can see how you can move from the Jeremiah sort of righteous remnant, sort of prophetic Deuteronomistic image to a sectarian, yes, we're the prophets, we're the righteous ones, and the rest of you are sort of ignorant fallen Israel. I read that everywhere in the Qumran literature, but I see Luke doing a similar kind of rhetoric, right? So I just don't want to dodge that sign. that rhetorical sign of we're the ones that understand the law, we're the ones that understand or that reverence the temple, and even kind of a negative rhetoric like, and all of you guys are the reason the temple got destroyed, so that sort of polemical rhetoric is I mean, to me, this is a sign of its Jewishness. So it's not. Again, I like Gabriella's distinction between sectarianism and Jewishness, because almost like the sectarian rhetoric of Luke Acts is what makes it so Jewish, if I can put it that way. Anyway, I'll stop there because I don't want to take up all the time. But just I loved how we drew out some of these big themes of temple and law and people. And particularly, just to recap, I liked how Jocelyn drew out the sort of prophetic line stuff, because I see that prophetic remnant theology is what gets repurposed both in Luke and the Qumran texts as sectarian rhetoric.
Thank you, Jason. Wendell, we go now to Jason Staples.
Hi, everybody. And I've got a few things here. First of all, this is very interesting for a lot of reasons. One of the things I will commend several of the speakers on is that I do think that these sections are best when we focus as much as possible on specific exegetical questions and on how we're reading specific things rather than continuing to chase our tail about questions of methodology. And actually, to start with Paul Sloan's paper, I think that initial point about how easy it is for the within Judaism stuff to become more or less confessional rather than and conclusion based rather than a methodological approach is, I think, a really important warning for all of us. And actually, I think in terms of his paper, I found that reading of the "Let the Dead Bury Their Own Dead" really an exemplary reading of Luke within Jewish halakhic discourse and logic. And I think one of the things I've really benefited from, not just there, but also in Paul's work in general, is his emphasis on how within the Gospels, not just Luke, but elsewhere, you have this emphasis on the higher importance of Jesus' restoration activities and how that interfaces as even more important than the temple. And I don't think you actually said that in this paper, but your point that that you made in your book, your recent book, which, by the way, if you've not gotten, folks, it's a really, really good book. You should get it and read it. But the thing that you highlighted, that one of the reasons, or maybe the reason, that takes precedent over the activities of the temple is that there are things that the temple cannot atone for. There are things that the temple cannot deal with that Jesus' mission actually does deal with in the Gospels. And so this passage, your specific exegesis of that, I found really compelling. Moving back to Jocelyn's paper, I thought the emphasis on the Deuteronomy 18:15-20 passage, and just the way that Luke connects all, not just Jesus, but all of the primary figures in the movement with Deuteronomy, with the prophetic mantle. And actually, I hadn't even made the connection, and I'm sure somebody else, I'm sure it's just because I haven't adequately read the literature, but just the reminder that when they see Jesus ascend, they get they receive the same kind of, they receive the Spirit, the same ability to do things in his legacy in the same way that it worked with Elijah. Was a connection that I'd not made, but I thought that was really really smart. And again, I don't know that if I've probably missed that elsewhere, but that was a good reminder. But I do think that within scholarship, the importance of Deuteronomy 18:15-20 and Luke Acts in general, I think is really not. I think it's not been adequately recognized, and I think your emphasis there is really really important. That does lead to some interesting potential conclusions coming out of Luke Acts in this respect, though, because as you pointed out, if the argument in Acts is that if your ears are attuned to the Torah and you're obedient, then you're going to follow Jesus, and if not, well, you read Stephen's speech, as you said. Stephen's speech says that when they sinned in the wilderness, God turned away from them. And as you said, the parallels between the prophets and Jesus are subtle and incisive repeatedly in Acts and in Luke. And the implication of that is, I'm not a fan of the word supersessionist, but certainly is sectarian to the place where those who do not follow Jesus may well find themselves. I mean, the implication of that, if I'm hearing you right, and I think if we're hearing Luke Acts right, this may be right. The implications are that if you're not following Jesus, then uh, God may turn away from you, and that you may find yourself on the outside, whether you're Jewish or not. So, that leads us to some of to go back to Paul Sloan's initial stuff. That might lead us to some conclusions that are not very palatable for the within Judaism school in general, but reading Luke Acts within Judaism or as Jewish texts may actually inevitably kind of lead us there. Uh, I'm on record in the past as saying that, I don't think that that's all that different from what they're doing at Qumran, so I'm maybe more open to that, but I do think that that's something we need to keep in mind. Uh, Jin, I hope you have scratched the cat's head that jumped in. I thought that was great. But I also thought that the therapeutic reading of Jesus in the temple, and the emphasis on the ambiguity of Jesus' answer, that I must be about the things of my father or in my father, like what of my father is he dealing with? That ambiguity and the way that you pointed out that sort of serves as a way to expand God's presence and purpose beyond the temple. I thought that was really, really, really interesting. And, I'm going to have to think more on it, but I think that's a fascinating reading and warrants more attention. And I want to see more on that because I do think that the ambiguity there and sort of the function of how that story works in some of the details that you brought out are really interesting. And that's worthy of, like I said, worthy of more study. I hope you go further with that, and I hope we can see more of it. Eyal, I think it's very your emphasis on the afternoon prayer bit and the connections there, and Acts being really the afternoon prayer in the temple, though connected with Daniel 9 and Judith 9. I think that is interesting. And then your later point that the importance of the temple in Luke, you say that it extends the proximity of the temple in its narrative to its readers effectively. I think that there's something to this in that once the temple is destroyed, there's some similarities here to some later rabbinic literature. Reading Luke and participating in the cultic life of Jesus followers after that, the way that Luke portrays this seems to be a way to participate in the temple service now that the temple is gone. And I think that that's something that sort of came to mind as you were working through that. You did point out Paul's acknowledgement of the authority of the high priest, even in a very unpleasant incident. I've wondered for a while whether or not there's a certain level of irony in Paul's response. Well, I wasn't aware that he was the high priest. And sure, he might be able to appeal to ignorance there, but that also might, in the way that Luke sometimes has Paul talk out of both sides of his mouth and in this kind of ironic way, that might be regarded as sort of a slighting way of saying, yeah, I'm not so sure he should be considered the high priest, especially given all of the, you know, you know, the give and take of who had been high priest for a good bit. And, is he the right high priest is, I think, part of the potential undertext there. Finally, Fadi, I think it's really important what you pointed out. Again, the consistent importance of the temple is there. I do wonder, though, about the impact. And you say, Paul continues to offer cultic worship. They continue to teach in the temple and all of that. I do wonder, though, about sort of what the narrative does with this, in that Jesus initially commands them to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, but they don't really launch out from the temple until they begin to get persecuted. And one of the things that we find is that that as they're doing things in the temple, every time they do things in the temple, it winds up resulting in some sort of negative hostility, persecution, that sort of thing throughout the narrative. So they're teaching, they're doing things in the temple until they're persecuted. They're arrested in the temple. Paul does what he does in the temple. He's properly doing the cultic the cultic worship according to Acts when he gets arrested. And I wonder sort of if there's an additional sort of subtext that's going on there with Acts in terms of how he understands that to work narratively. What is he saying? Is he saying something? Is there something that we should be reading between the lines in terms of every time it seems that the group or an individual is doing something in the temple, it ends up sort of working badly for that group or individual before too long? And I do wonder what that means. And, again, knowing that the temple is destroyed, and this is written in the after effects of that, and, some of the setup, especially in Stephen's speech, between the difference in the heavenly temple versus the earthly temple, that might set us up to think a little bit about that as well. And again, I'm just putting that on the table as something we should be asking, but I do think it's a question worth asking, especially in light of all the good insights that you had in your paper. So I will yield the floor. I've probably gone over time, but those are my initial responses.
Great. We will go to the third and next Jason Moraf, as the next discussant.
What are the odds?
Yes, thank you, Isaac. And thank you, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. There's some really excellent points for reflection. I know my head is still spinning about new possibilities for understanding Luke 2 in light of the temple's destruction. I want to highlight two issues for consideration regarding approach. I'm going to frame them specific to Luke Acts, but I think they have broader implications for the broader conversation. And as the last in the line of Jason's, I think I'm just going to be highlighting or restating points that Jasons who have gone before me have made. So the first one, like others yesterday, Paul Sloan has brought up this preference for reading these texts as Jewish texts rather than framing them as within Judaism because of this. And I think it's a great caution. It's become a school, and that tends to be associated with sets of conclusions, not method, approach, leading us to exclude others who are sensitive to the Jewish context based on the conclusions that they reach. And I think this is a really important point. That said, I do want to raise the issue that, especially when it comes to Luke's writings, we still have to clarify what we mean when we say that Luke's writings are Jewish texts. Is this to say that Luke is not a Christian text? Then we have to clarify, well, what do we mean by Christian text? Here I'll note the recent work of Joshua Paul Smith, which has been really important in this regard. But what is it that makes a text Jewish? Is it a Jewish author, as Joshua Paul Smith has argued? Is it Jewish reasoning, Jewish sources, commitment to Jewish things like the temple, the Torah, or commitment or identification with the Jewish people themselves, or some conglomeration of that, the idea of commitment to the idea of Israel? And I'll suggest that last point, what Luke thinks of the Jewish people, will be the sticking point. So, but to finish this first point, I think at the end of the day, we have to delineate what we mean by qualifying Luke's writings as Jewish texts, the standards by which we evaluate that. And I say this as somebody who prefers that language. And I think Paul Sloan has identified, or has done that nicely, has exemplified that in his approach and pushing us towards the question of method and approach rather than conclusion. But I still wanted to raise the point that we still have to define our terms and clarify things, especially with Luke, who has long been thought to be the Gentile author, the universally oriented author, the most Christian of them, of the Gospels, if you will. And so this moves me to my second point, that defining Luke's writings, especially Acts, it is interesting to me that most of the comments have focused on Luke's Gospel, because reading Luke's Gospel as a Jewish text almost seems easier because Acts has largely been read as legitimating the movement away from Judaism, that Luke constructs the Christian movement as no longer Jewish, or at least on its way to becoming no longer Jewish. And this is by and large related to the issue of the Judaioi in Acts. We have the same issue or an analogous issue that the Gospel of John has. Who are Judaioi? Why are they characterized in a particular kind of way? And Acts doesn't let us have the geographically limited answer that we might get with John because that term arises mostly in the diaspora. So this is the second issue, and I think the work of somebody like Shelley Matthews has put this forward as really the stumbling block for reading Luke's writings as Jewish texts. Namely, what does Luke think of actual Jews? What is his relationship to the wider Jewish populace? This is why in my own monograph I tried to address it. And I think there's a need for some greater work in this area. I think some comparative work would be really helpful in these lines to ask the question, does Luke, to what degree is Luke sectarian? Is he in competition? Is there a degree of animosity? How sectarian is he? Or does he sound like, Jews arguing with other Jews, or does he sound like the later apologists who are really keeping the Jewish populace at arm's length and defining his movement as not them? I.e., does Luke like Jewish things but not actual Jewish people? So is he a step between the clearly within Judaism Gospels and the later apologists? I'll say that I think Jocelyn's response of framing this within the line of prophets and within the historic characterization of Israel's general resistance to what God is up to is an important way forward. I think Jin Young has proposed another way forward with reflecting on trauma and how is Luke participating in rethinking the direction for the Jewish ancestral tradition. So I just wanted to raise those two issues and highlight that last one because I think it's really pressing for us today.
Thank you, Jason Morav. Our fourth discussant, excuse me, is Joshua Jip. Joshua?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been really invigorating, and the response I want to give has changed about 3 or 4 times as I've been listening to different panelists and respondents. So let me not try to give a summary of anything, but throw out a sort of Isaac encouraged us to brainstorm, so let me throw out another question, and it's related to this the language of sectarianism. I'm wondering, Luke seems to, and I'm going to focus more on the book on Acts here, but Luke seems to have, a concern to, as people have noted, to defend some of the early Christian protagonists and some of the specific language that's used. For Stephen, for example, is blasphemy against God, blasphemy against Moses and the temple. And then with Paul, the language that is used is apostasy. So I'm wondering if there are sort of like, were we able to, and I know this is impossible, but were we able to talk to the opponents of Stephen or the opponents of Paul? Would they be comfortable saying that this early Christian movement still is operating within Judaism, or are there potential limits to that? In other words, and let me use a contemporary analogy. I'm a Christian, but if there are certain Christians that would be, let's say, and we can study them 2,000 years later, and they're operating with claims about the Bible, but they use the language of the Bible, or they talk about Jesus, or they talk about prayer, but they actually, marshal it in a certain way that it's now a strange religion, or it's something that's completely, antithetical in some ways, but they're still using the texts and the symbols and, in certain ways. Are there certain limits to where I would say, yes, that is still, using some of the symbols and the ideas and the names, but it's now been marshaled into a completely, new religion or a new, faith or something along those lines. Anyway, I think to some extent, like Acts is trying to, right, going back to something that Paul said here, is trying to say, yes, Jesus is the resurrected Messiah, exalted at God's right hand, and we want to still claim prayer, temple, fasting, all of the traditional, certain things that are associated with Judaism. But if you accept their claims, it's now going to, basically put you into something that still retains some of the roots and the legacy of of Judaism, or what the Sanhedrin, or what some of the other, Jewish protagonists, at least as we have access to them in the book of Acts, would maintain. But it's now been worked up into something that's, pretty remarkably new and different. And as a result, we now have to, be on the defensive to give claims um, that yes, we're faithful to the Torah, and no, we're not apostates from Moses. No, we do not blaspheme God and the temple and the Torah. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is I greatly appreciate the reading the text of Acts within Judaism. I think it's, as the first Jason mentioned, it is a move away from some of the problematic 19th century Germans. And yet, to some extent, there's the question of still of so what? What is the reason for all of the apologetic, all of the defense? Can the symbols and the text sort of be marshaled in a certain way that it you might be able to sympathetically say with the Sanhedrin, they're using our texts, or they're using our symbols, or they're using some of our traditions, but they've now organized it in a way that it's something different, and it's something problematic. So just throwing that out there. I appreciate some of the, it's Jewish, I think we can all in some ways take that for granted, but so what? I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. We have one more discussant before we can open the floor for further interaction amongst the panelists and the other participants. Adrian Taranzano.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this discussion. First of all, I must apologize for my English because I haven't practiced it for a long, long time, as you will know. Well, I'll try to speak clear. First of all, I must say that I agree with this perspective, which would have been fast, almost unthinkable some years ago. As I was a student, I was taught that Luke was the most Greek among the evangelists. I also remember that that once I have read that someone claimed that Luke was in fact Plutarch. I would like here only to add some remarks to Jocelyn's paper. I was happy to hear some examples taken from the infancy narrative. The infancy narrative, in my view, provides a key for understanding this perspective. Look within Judaism, or look within Hellenistic Judaism. This narrative has often been regarded as an example of Greek literature. For instance, in use of syncrecy, a typically Greek rhetorical form, or its appeal to ideas of virginal conception. But I think there are further elements to consider. For example, the infancy narrative begins in the temple not only with an angel, but also with an angel known by name, Gabriel, announced to Zechariah. This scene reflects both Jewish angelology and tradition of Annunciation stories, which are attested in biblical as well as Greco-Roman sources. I think Luke consciously situates his history within the Old Testament tradition, echoing the verse of Isaac, Samson, or others. The prominence of Gabriel, Matthew doesn't name angel, but its prominence, Gabriel in Luke, means continuity with Jewish tradition and his role parallels that of other angelical figures who act as guides, messengers, and protectors in apocryphal and pseudepigraphical literature. Luke's account of Jesus' conception by the Holy Spirit is often interpreted as a borrowing from Greco-Roman divine birth myth. Yet this motive can also be located firmly within Jewish traditions. The miraculous births of patriarchs and prophets provide precedents, while Second Enoch offers an especially striking parallel in its description of the miraculous non-sexual conception of Melchizedek. This tradition, which may itself be connected with exegetical interpretation of Psalm 110, demonstrate that concepts of divine began to circulate within Jewish thought and were not limited to Greek mythology. Thus, Lucan infancy narrative can be understood as a product of the Jewish Hellenistic religious environment. Luke narrative reflects the worldwide of a Jewish believer embedded in the Greco-Roman oikoumene. Ultimately, Luke depicts Jesus as both the fulfillment of Israel's hope and the light for all the nation. A vision encapsulated in Simeon's confession from the temple. In this confession lies a criterion for interpreting Luke as a fundamentally Jewish work. The permanent role of Israel in the history of salvation. Jesus of Nazareth is phos eis apocalypsin ethnon, kai doxa laousu Israel, a light for the Gentiles and glory of his people Israel. I think that a similar conviction appears also in Acts. For example, the gift of the Holy Spirit is poured out first upon the Jews of the diaspora and then also upon Gentiles. I think there's a similarity with this conviction. And I think that it's a conviction of a Jewish believer. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. We now have about, I'd say, 40 minutes or so for discussion. And maybe what we can do first is provide the opportunity for any of the panelists on this Luke and Acts panel to interact with one another if they want to respond to comments or questions that have been raised or to matters that are featured on the chat buttons. You can go ahead and do that right now. I've been trying also to stimulate some discussion, being the devil's advocate, if I may, but really seriously taking the alternative positions into consideration. Is there anybody who'd like to respond to the responses?
Oh.
Jen, yes.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much. I was reading a couple of comments on the chat first, so I'll just start with that first before I address the respondents. So here was the question about the Stephen, right? Stephen in chapter 6, and I think it's fascinating. It's just like a chapter that I always go to, and I wonder if I see a similar move that I observed in my passage, Luke 2, where Jesus or Luke is really presenting this expanded understanding of the temple, especially of the void of the physical temple for those people who are grappling with the question about how do we deal with this absence of the temple. And I think what Stephen was doing in chapter 6 is basically his recount of Israel's history as they really focused on the wandering of those patriarchs, and God's been with them throughout their wandering and being sojourns. And at the point when people were expecting that this physical temple is going to be like the glorified temple that Solomon has built. Well, actually, the speech just quickly turns into saying that God does not dwell in this physicality of the temple, thus really again redirecting people's attention to imagine something that is happening outside of the physicality of the temple. I wonder if we are seeing some parallel movement over there in that passage as well. Um, Another question, I do think that yes, the coming of the nations is a consolation of Israel. I think that's also what we've seen in James' speech, where the God's favor on Israel is directly connected to the following passage on the Gentile. We are going out to the Gentiles. So um yeah, the Jewishness, as someone was mentioning, when someone in the first century reads this gospel or Acts, there's no way that this author is not a Jew or somehow like really, really just operating within that Jewish thought word and hope. Yeah, I'll just stop here because I don't want to like dominate like the floor, but these are just my quick answers as I was reviewing the top part of the chat.
Thanks for that, Jen. Your last point makes me think of one of the witty illustrations that Daniel Boyarin made that I've heard once at least. Imagine if Constantine had not converted to Christianity, and in this hypothetical situation, Christianity just kind of faded out of history, remained a tiny sect, and we were to later discover in caves in the Judean desert texts written by an unknown Jewish sect, texts like Luke, maybe texts like James yesterday. What would our response be? How would we categorize those texts? So on that thought, I leave and let Paul Slono, as his virtual hand raise, talk.
Thanks very much. And sorry, I will probably need to leave soon. I'm actually teaching a class right now, but it's an exam day, so I have someone helping me proctor the exam while I give a comment. So we've talked a lot about so Jason Maraff, you thanks for your comments and response. You talked a lot about we still have to, if we say it's a Jewish text, we still have to define and go on from there, which I totally agree with it. And then that's part of what I was trying to do with saying distinctively defining or characterizing Luke Acts as the kind of text that's interested in restoration eschatology. And the restoration eschatology aspect is important. And I think it helps us distinguish, we're talking a lot about sects and sectarianism and groupness. And I think we need to distinguish groups with defined boundaries over against necessarily a sectarian reading that's more of a remnant thing. So groups, right? Pharisees are a group. They have groupness to them. They have boundaries to their, presumably they have boundaries. We don't have a ton of evidence about sort of late Second Temple Pharisaism, but presumably they have group boundaries. But I don't think that, I think that Pharisees think that non-Pharisees are still part of Israel, and they're not sort of on the outs. It's not like they're not true Israel and only the Pharisees are. To the Sadducees, I think the Sadducees are a group. I don't think that they think non-Sadducees aren't, true Israelites or true Israel or something like that. That's distinct though from a group whose groupness is defined in terms of, well, we think that we're the avant-garde of the Restoration. And that's what I think distinguishes, say, the group responsible for the Damascus document and the Synoptic Gospels. So there's a groupness there that's defined not simply because we have our own halakhic practices and they're distinct from yours, but in terms of, no, as I think it was Jason Wendell's point about, I think these Synoptic Gospels, I'm talking about Luke, but I think all the Synoptic Gospels have are reading their present in terms of the Deuteronomic history, in which, Israel was still under the punitive discipline promised by the prophets, but now is the time of Deuteronomy 30's promised restoration, and that John and Jesus are being depicted as those who are heralding this restoration. And so with that, though, from both the Torah texts that talk about restoration and the prophetic texts that retrieve them and the late Second Temple texts that exegete these passages, what is necessary to participate in the restoration is that the fellow Israelites return or repent or join this movement. And so then that's where I think you see a lot of commonality in a lot of late Second Temple Jewish texts. I think this is such a common reading in late Second Temple Judaism. So many late Second Temple Jewish texts are reading that are present in that moment in a given text is speaking to or suggesting that you ought to return in the way that my text thinks you should. And it's not just we keep talking about Qumran. I mean, yes, it's obviously there and pretty obviously in the Damascus document. It's in like it's I think it's implicit in Second Maccabees. I think it's there in 1 Enoch. It's there in the Animal Apocalypse and the Apocalypse of Weeks. In Jubilees 23, in Judith, or not Judith, rather, well, possibly, but Tobit, Baruch, and of course the Synoptic Gospel. This is not sort of an anomalous thing. And so what's distinctive then is not that the Gospels are participating in this restoration eschatological framework. The distinctiveness is that they're saying it's right now and it's through this guy, and so get on board. And so that they're depicted. That's why I emphasize both the framework, restoration eschatology, and that what's distinctive about it is not that framework, but their claim that Jesus is that guy. Right? Jesus is the one divinely authorized by God, and that's what then, in my view, that helps explain some of the controversies. That's like the interlocutors in the Gospels and Acts. They tend to then the controversies tend to boil over to the point of, okay, well, are you really that divinely authorized one? How could we know? Show us a sign. And then same with the apostles in Acts. They think that no, we've really been commissioned. We've really seen the Messiah. He's really exalted. And we've really been commissioned by him to do this. And so we're going to obey that rather than any other thing. That doesn't compromise, in my view, it doesn't compromise Torah observance or anything like that. But it does help frame the synoptic, or Luke, I'll just stay with Luke Acts, frame them as operating within this framework. And my point is to say that that's not anomalous. What's anomalous is the particular claims they're making in those texts with respect to the Messiah. And then, of course, after that, the apostles. That may help us sort of distinguish sectarianism from just groupness, because those aren't the same thing. Thanks. And sorry if I have to suddenly leave, I'm going to class. All right.
I was going to say, bring the students to join but they have an exam.
Sure, Paul. You're going to class, right?
They're taking an exam on Genesis right now, so.
All right. Well, thanks for the comments. Very, very helpful comments. There's several hands raised. In the way that I perceived them, I think Jason Wendell, you did have your hand raised, and it seemed like it was first and in response to what Paul Sloan was saying, was prompted by that.
You can skip over me. I think he handled it really well. I couldn't say it better.
Okay. All right. So I'll go to Eyal Regev and then to Jason Moref.
Yeah, some of the discussant, and I think Gabriel, nice message concluding the Matthew sessions yesterday, referred to the concept of sectarianism, and I want to comment about that. If it's not exactly what people mean by when they use the phrase sectarian, and this is a long tradition between different Christian, modern or early modern Christian parties and so on. But I think when you mention sectarian in relation to Christianity vis-a-vis other Jews and so on, if you mention, if you refer to hostility, separation, and things like that, that's one thing. But sociologically speaking, I don't think this is the correct concept. Well, long ago, I wrote an article that in general, early Christians were not sectarians. And later on, I suggested another concept, more nuanced, that I think encapsulates most of the early Christian texts and groups and so on, which is a new religious movement or a cult. And of course, some Christian, early Christian groups or perhaps texts are closer to the sectarian concept of more meticulous separation or higher boundaries and so on. But in general, I think this is not the issue, the main issue. The main issue is the newness, the freshness of Christians' beliefs and concept, that this is what made them different from other Jews or so on. And this is very different from what we are seeing in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran and so on. And there's an enormous difference between how the self-identity of the early Christians is set in comparison to those of the Yachad and the Damascus covenant.
Okay. Thanks for that. Food for thought there on this ongoing discussion about sectarianism. Jason Morath?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to underline, I think, what Paul was saying, because I think framing Luke's writings in the wider discourse about Israel and Israel's direction and the people, and I think the peoplehood of Israel has been somewhat of a missing piece in this conversation, because as Jason Wendell pointed out in his response, the Jewishness of Luke's writings has been long recognized. That Luke likes Jewish signs and symbols. The issue is he appropriating them from the genealogical people of Israel? Is he appropriating from the Jews? And so I think framing it within this kind of this restoration approach and concern for the people in their direction is a helpful and important step forward, because it can encompass those themes, as Paul, I think your work has certainly done well. And it helps us reframe, I think, along the lines of what Eyal has brought up, as seeing the way as a subgroup, as a movement that is inviting the rest of Israel, or warning the rest of Israel of what might happen if they don't join, because claims that we get the tradition correct and therefore you all should repent and join what we're up to, what God is doing in our group, is different than what you see in the later apologists, which seems to be, we have inherited the tradition and we are the correct ones, God has rejected you, rather than, if you don't repent, this is what happens. That's a different kind of exclusivist claim. That's a get on the train, God is up to something new, you need to get on board, otherwise you'll get left behind, versus it's ours now, which is I assume will come up tomorrow in the discussion of other texts.
Yeah, I mean, I got a question kind of like in response to that, and anticipating a bit what is going to happen with the, I suppose you're alluding, Jason Morath, to the final session tomorrow. What does it take for a text like Luke and Acts to be outside of Judaism? And this is a question not just for Luke and Acts in particular. I don't want to single out Luke and Acts, but for any of the texts we've discussed so far, Matthew, what would it take for us, or for some of us, to say this is a text outside of Judaism? I'm just trying to be self-critical here and think about how, in not just in rather recent times, people would be saying these are texts outside of Judaism, opposed to Judaism. And here we are now. It's like, yeah, it's a Jewish text. Everything's nice and dandy. To what extent is this a reflection of our current zeitgeist? But that's a big question. We can come back to that. I feel like some of the comments perhaps were addressed a bit in response to what Paul said. And because you're proctoring exam, Paul, I would allow you, if you want to, you don't have to respond to some of the comments before I turn to other panelists on the floor.
Nothing much to add. I thought I appreciate, just I'll add my appreciation for Maraf's last point about there's a distinction between saying, hey, restoration's here now, get on board, over against subsequent centuries where they're saying, no, this is all ours now, and you've been disinherited. That's a distinct claim and vocabulary, and it's distinct from what Jesus and the apostle, in my reading of it, and what Jesus and the apostles are doing, because in the Jesus and the apostles, they come from a desire that Israel get on board, right? Fellow Israelites, fellow Jews, their preaching and summoning is from a desire that right? This come on board. And like, you notice the stark contrast of Jesus approaching Jerusalem and weeping over the fact that it will be destroyed, over against sort of the glee you might find in subsequent centuries about, oh, that's exactly, it's ours now. And of course that was destroyed because it was a literal observance that was garbage. Very different approaches that I think that you see in the Gospels and Acts over against subsequent centuries. Anyway, I've talked enough. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Although, yeah, this could go back and forth in a pil-pul fashion here. I'm thinking of Acts 3:23, 3:22 to 23, Peter warning the people, be careful, right? If you don't heed to this prophet, then you might be cut off. So there's a desire for them to be incorporated, to join as Israelites into Israel, but what if you don't accept this message? So yeah, I know I'm bringing it up there. We can come back to that. I want to turn our attention to Jocelyn.
So I'm going to change the topic just a little bit. I've just come to think of, as much as Luke really, has props for the temple and the high priest, he really sort of totally undermines the work of Pharisees. And there's one passage which is not unique to Luke, although he's sort of tweaked it for his own purposes. But this is a passage that's also in Matthew. And it's the one that goes, he's saying all the woes to the Pharisees and the scribes. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. So you are witnesses and approve of the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them and you build their tombs. For this reason, the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets and shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you what will be charged against this generation. And just what a, this is Jesus speaking, and he's really dealing the Pharisees a huge blow. When he says about the blood of the prophets and the blood of Abel and the blood of Zechariah, it's a synecdoche. It's a synecdoche. Abel was the first murdered person, and his blood cried to God from the earth for revenge. And then Zechariah, if you take the Tanakh, then Second Chronicles, I think, is the last book in that order. And the last person killed in that book is Zechariah. And as he died, he cried out for God to revenge. So I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up, that that's just a part of Luke, that's something he adopted, that's something he changed. And my hair stands on end when I'm saying these things.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. Those are important questions and passages, the problematic passages maybe that we can address and think about it in comparison with Matthew, for example. How do the Pharisees fare, pun intended there, in Luke versus Matthew, and what does this say about the respective texts? But I want to give opportunities for the others who have been patiently waiting with their virtual hands raised. We'll proceed with Fadi and then Jason, and we can come back to some of the questions that have been raised by the others.
Well, yeah, actually, lots of interesting thoughts especially about the temple. So I'm just gonna bring us back to the temple. And usually, one of the books or the figures that come to my mind when I read about the temple in Luke Acts and think about it is the figures of Ezekiel or Jeremiah, and Ezekiel more into this discussion, because I wonder to what extent would Luke's position on the temple would be different than Ezekiel's position on the temple, on how they would be related or how they would be different than each other's. Ezekiel pictured the abandonment of the kavod, or the glory of God. There is sense of an abandonment that happens in the narrative of Ezekiel. Still, would we call Ezekiel a text that is not Jewish? How they are related? Of course, we all wish that there was this feeling of unrest in the text of Luke, Luke Acts. You feel this unrest that at some point there are passages that we wish they were not there. Jesus speaks about the destruction of the temple. I think that the common theme between Ezekiel and Luke is that they both mourn these events of destruction. They both mourn that this result. They both would wish that we do not arrive at this conclusion, that the temple would be destroyed at some point. And I think even that while we have a fruitful discussion about sectarianism, but even on a smaller scale, someone like Jeremiah would have been easily called a traitor for his people. Like just because he was leaving the city, trying to go out when the Babylonians were surrounding it, would be easily considered as a traitor to his people. Does that mean that he's not Jewish anymore? That he ceases to be a Jewish person? So could be sectarianism as we're discussing it, could be different other things. I think that the most important thing to keep in mind is that the Gospels are circumstantial literature, and so they were written. Perhaps we can glean some sort of like the what I would call the default view of the temple and the answers to the what if, or the more on the sides, the answers to questions on the side. So that's why I see that the consistent view overall, Luke Acts would be positive regarding the position of the temple, but also there is this unrest related to the rhetoric of arguing together. Whether this on a group to a group, on a personal level, could be different scenarios that we can imagine behind this unrest in the text. But perhaps reading Luke Acts along with the prophetic text like Ezekiel, Jeremiah can give us just better insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi. There are some interesting comments happening in parallel in writing. I won't respond to those right now, but if we have time, we can come back to those. Jason Wendell.
I'll be quick so we can discuss those, because I'm really just cycling back to what you and Jocelyn were talking about. So very quickly, like when it comes to that question, like what would it take for Luke to be outside of Judaism? I do think and admitting all the troubles with defining Judaism, that distinction that Jason Marath and Paul Sloan were dividing between some of the rhetoric of the later apologists, who they see themselves, like their emic perspective is that they're outside of Judaism. They're like, you guys are the Israelites, you're the Jews, and you're rejected, and we're the Gentiles. So that's a very different rhetoric than what we see in Luke Acts. So I think that distinction is helpful, just to be like, obviously there's something different going on in Luke. But I'm sort of with you, Isaac, and you, Jocelyn, in that like that doesn't like help us dodge the fact that there are like pretty tough claims, and the rhetoric, whether we call it sectarian rhetoric or not, the rhetoric is quite strong in Luke Acts about this group and their particular identity with Jesus, and the harsh indictments of those that don't recognize Jesus. And I agree, Fadi, that I mean, Luke wants you to see them. Yeah, we're just like the prophets. We're just like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but still, the question of is it outside? I mean, I don't think it's outside Judaism, but I also share, theological convictions with these texts. And to highlight some of Joshua Jipp's writings, and also a comment he made, like, I think other Jews could be forgiven for saying, you are outside of us, and so I just think it's worth asking, like, from whose perspective are we asking this question? If we're asking the question and this is what I was mentioning yesterday, like, from the emic perspective of the texts themselves, of course, Luke Acts sees itself as the true line of Israel, so from that perspective, of course it's within. But if we go to questions like, well, it depends who you ask. Are you asking Jewish Christians this? Are you asking the Pharisees this? And so on. You might get different answers to whether they belong within and without. And that, I mean, that's how most movements are. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point too much. So.
Oh, thanks for that. We can counter, balance some of the comments that I even made. One is, yeah, granted the polemics against the Pharisees, Justin, they're there. That's a fact. It's undeniable. But then we also have Paul, who identifies as a Pharisee in Acts. And also to comment in the chat box about Israel versus, or Israelitism versus Judaism. I'm not a big fan of isms. Acts also is the text where we have Paul saying, Ego Judaios eimi, I am a Jew, right? Explicit identification with a Jew. So these are complex matters. Logan William is actually one of the attendees who has a question or comment to make. And so this opportunity to maybe expand the participation and allow Logan to make some comments.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Thank you all for this great discussion. I just want to throw in a brief comment on what you said, Isaac, about the invectives against the Pharisees, and then reinvigorate something that Paul Sloan said, but I don't think has been picked up. From what I can tell in these discussions, often, the very, very harsh invectives against other Jews, especially the Pharisees, are kind of seen as problem texts for the within Judaism approach. I don't see why, therefore, 4Q MMT would also be considered outside Judaism, because 4Q MMT says that the covenant curses have come upon Israel because of Pharisaic law. And CD says that the reason why Alexander Yanneus killed 800 of them in one day was because of their horrible interpretation of Torah. So basically, they're excluded from the family and they don't inherit, they get the curses. So that's CD 116 through 17. I don't see why these kinds of invectives against even the vast majority of people who would have obeyed Pharisaic law, Qumran says, you're disobedient and you're out. Even if we believe in the restoration of Israel, people who abide by Pharisaic law, according to 4Q Pesher Nahum, will not inherit in the Olam Haba. So I just want to throw in, are we biased towards the Christian text and thinking this shows them outside Judaism, but when Jews do this to other Pharisees, we're like, nah, there's no problem there because, I don't know, they're weird or something. So that's one thing, but people can pick up on that if they want. I want to also bring up, this is just a question for everyone. Paul Sloan raised the question of whether within Judaism is a method or a set of assumptions or a set of premises. I don't think necessarily either of these are better or worse than the others, but I think in these discussions, it's not clear. People talk about they use the word approach, but I'm wondering if what all the panelists think of, and I don't necessarily have an opinion about this, but I'd love to invigorate the discussion about whether within Judaism is a set of methodological tools or whether it's a set of premises that help guide the rest of the discussion. And what do you all think about that? Anyways, thank you for inviting me to speak. Not inviting me, but letting me speak,
Yes, no, thanks, Logan. Very pertinent questions. Good comments. I don't know. So maybe we have polemics in other Second Temple Jewish texts. Is there now a certain kind of bias, as Logan phrased it, against the Christian text, so to speak, about their inherent anti-Jewishness, or are there other factors that maybe are determining our uneasiness with saying, these texts are just like any other Second Temple Jewish texts when it comes to the polemical passages, I mean. Maybe there are other factors. Is it, for example, the inclusion of Gentiles, maybe not inclusion of Gentiles as such, but the criteria for including the Gentiles, or that the Gentiles are in some way Israel? That is the scandal that makes these texts make them be placed outside of Judaism. So that's just like a preliminary response to what Logan raised there. Some fine questions and comments. How do people deal here? So I'm just going to go ahead, if there aren't other comments from the panelists, with the ending of Acts, because the ending of Acts is one of those passages that people turn to definitely to make an argument that this is now a Gentile Christian text, right? So even if a certain flavor within Christianity, definitely outside of Judaism. Uh, any thoughts on that? Yes, Joshua.
Well, I'm kind of, to some extent, just still, processing Logan's first question, and to
Uh-huh.
some extent, maybe re-articulating what you said, Isaac, with your anecdote of what Daniel Boyarin had said at one point. But I guess I just throw out there and say, if people were, reading 4Q MMT for the next few centuries as sacred literature, along with a variety of other texts that they had grouped together, and whatever. I mean, and they became a Gentile majority group. I mean, to some extent, it's like I don't know if there's such radical differences as much as there is, thinking about Acts becoming sort of a sacred text that's read together with these other sacred texts that's then, being read not predominantly by Jews, but by other Gentiles. In other words, do you have to explain sort of like a lot of what we're doing here as something that isn't just examining the text on its own terms, but ultimately the text's reception, I guess. So I'm just sort of processing out loud here in response to Logan's question.
No, that's an excellent point. Christianity did not remain ein unbekannte jüdische Sekt, an unknown Jewish sect, but became the largest religion in the world. Gabriele.
Of course, we should be aware that the way in which you use the term Judaism today is very different from the way in which it was used in antiquity. We have been reminded a lot also by Jason Staple, of this point. For us, Judaism is the entire religion of Israel. For ancient people, it could denote a certain way of living or understanding the religion of Israel. So we must be careful, in terms we must be aware of this kind of different language. I think that the question that Isaac asked some time ago about what makes a text no longer a Jewish text is an important question. Probably we'll start discussing this even in the next session, okay, with the letter to the Hebrews. But it's a fundamental question because I don't see honestly, I don't see any difference between this body of Christian literature and the Dead Sea Scrolls or Philo. They are new, okay. Also Philo is new, also the Dead Sea Scrolls are new. But when is this novelty becomes something that separates the group from the entire religion of Israel? Here I agree with what has been said before, that certainly we understand that there is a clear difference between what many Christian texts, New Testament texts are saying in the first century is very different from what later apologists were saying. So let's say, how can we deal with these nuances and also with the transition between this test and later test? So some test looks very sectarian, some test looks less sectarian. I remember we will have a discussion also on the Gospel of John, of course, that certainly at least is very sectarian. But the problem for us is to find a narrative in which we include all these nuances. Christianity was certainly born as a Jewish messianic and apocalyptic movement, then became something else. Okay, and there are many stages in this process. So how can you find a narrative in which all these different stages are recognized in a clear way without eliminating any nuances? Without simply remaining prisoners of the alternative of being Jewish or non-Jewish.
Thank you, Gabriele. How different a text like Luke and Acts may be to some of the apologists that will be discussed remains to be seen, and we'll discuss that tomorrow. But that's a very important observation and one reason why we wanted to expand our scope of literature covered in this conference. We might have room for one more comment or question, and Eric, who is one of the panelists for the next session on Hebrews, has the virtual hand raised. So, Eric, why don't you go ahead? This will be a warm-up for what is to come.
I will anticipate a couple of things that I wanted to add to what Gabriele was saying. Two things that I think that we have to remember why we got to the within Judaism perspective, because in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century exegesis, we try to understand to understand the New Testament, to interpret the New Testament within paganism, within Hellenism, and we didn't succeed. It just didn't work very well. That's the point. And then finally, with Qumran discoveries and rediscovering of all the apocryphal, deuterocanonical, pseudepigraphical book, and so on, we found out that within Judaism is a much better context to understand the New Testament, much better than paganism. And this, I think, leads us to a main consequence that we have two choices. One is within paganism, and the other one is within Judaism. And Christianity is within Judaism. Christianity is a form of Judaism, of first century Judaism. So there is not a third option, I think, nowadays. And this is, I think, the main consequence of the within Judaism perspective. And the second point, I think that is all, maybe even more important, if possible, of the first one, is that we finally, in some way, it's always difficult to overcome these things, but we found out that there was too much polemic between Christians and Jews within the exegesis of the Bible in general terms. So we, as scholars, we said, okay, we have stop with this polemical use of the terms Judaism, Christianity, Christian, and so on. Let's try to use them historically. This creates lots of problems because the word Judaism comprehends, I don't know, it's very difficult to create a new terminology today, but I think that is the second main important, the second most important premise of the within Judaism perspective. We don't want to be influenced by this 2000-year polemic between Judaism and Christianity. So I think that these two things are very important, I think, to understand why within Judaism approach is important and what characterizes this approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And you made me think of the book Paul Within Paganism, a recent publication. One of the editors is Paula Fredrickson, who has, I believe, been attending some of the sessions of this conference. So maybe we need to have a conference on Paul within Judaism, within paganism, or the New Testament as such. It's time for us to stop, unfortunately. Time flies, but we do need to take a little pause for the organizers who are preparing for the next session. I want to thank all of the panelists, the discussants, for today's first panel, day 2 of Luke and Acts. Thanks for your participation. You are all welcome to join us tomorrow morning for the recap session that will be at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So if there are any volunteers, in fact, that would like to share some words about the highlights today, please contact me. Otherwise, be well.